I'd like to call the hearing to order this morning. The title of our hearing is the Fiscal Year 2015 EPA Budget, and we certainly want to welcome EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy for being here with us today and talking about the budget and other actions that are taking place over at EPA. You want to start my 3 minutes? Each of us that are giving opening statements today, we're given 3 minutes because we want to be able to get to the budget and talk about a lot of issues. Jonathan Turley, a professor over at George Washington University, was testifying before the Judiciary Committee recently, and in his testimony he said that President Obama's extensive use of executive orders, executive actions, and unilateral regulatory action threatens to enable President Obama to become a government unto himself. Now, Professor Turley said that he had voted for President Obama, but that he was genuinely concerned about this excessive use of executive authority. And when President Obama went to Copenhagen in 2009, he committed the U.S. to certain things relating to climate change. In his Georgetown speech and in his State of the Union address, he has repeatedly indicated that since Congress does not act in the way that he wants it to act, that he is going to do things by executive order and he will go it alone. And I would say, first of all, that Congress has acted in the areas that the President is concerned about. Congress made the decision, a Democratic-controlled Senate made the decision that we would not adopt cap-and-trade. And then I might say that 2 weeks ago, the House of Representatives passed legislation for the first time ever, gave EPA the authority to regulate CO2 emissions, but set parameters. And in our efforts to work with the administration on that legislation, we were not responded to. And even Mr. Dingell has repeatedly said when the Clean Air Act was passed, it was never thought that CO2 emissions would be adopted. One of the things I'm most concerned about is that the new source performance standards for new electricity generating units, this proposal requires carbon capture and storage for coal-fired power plants, which are not commercially available, have not been adequately demonstrated. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 clearly prohibits EPA from relying on federally funded projects when determining whether CCS is adequately demonstrated. And yet EPA went and took 3 projects in the U.S., one in Texas, one in California, and one in Mississippi, none of which are in operation. 2 of them have not even started construction. And so I think this reflects how aggressive the administration is being. As a matter of fact, it was pointed out to us that GAO's database said that EPA had published over 1,900 rules during the President's first term alone. So we have some genuine concerns, and my time has expired, so at this time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for his opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly want to thank the Administrator McCarthy, for being with us here today. I want to take a few moments, just a quick second or so, to extend my congratulations to you. I was on leave of absence for a number of months due to my wife's very serious illness, so I didn't get a chance to say congratulations. So I want to congratulate you. It's belated, but it's heartfelt. Madam Administrator, your visit here could not be more timely, as it coincides with the release earlier this week of the second report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which warned that the detrimental effects of man-made climate change are being felt. And it also warned that if we fail to address this issue, we can continue to expect dire consequences for humans and natural systems all across our globe. According to the report, the flooding, the heat waves, the reduced crop yields that we have witnessed recently, both here and abroad, are only going to get worse if we do not act to curb the effects of climate change sooner rather than later. In fact, as the chairman of the IPCC noted when the study was released, and I quote, "Nobody on the planet is going to be untouched by the impacts of climate change," end of quote. So, Madam Administrator, I, for one, want to applaud your agency for your outstanding work, for being on the front lines of our nation's fight against the impacts of climate change, and I certainly do not envy the task that all of you face. In a time when the EPA's budget is consistently being slashed, the American people are still relying on you and your agency to do everything in its power to protect the public health, both today and for future generations of American families. The President's FY15 budget request of $7.89 billion represents a $310 million decrease from last year's level, and in fact represents a smaller budget than that which was enacted in FY03 under President Bush. And my Republican colleagues would slash this budget even further in an attempt to hamstring your agency, all while the world's leading scientists warn us of all the calamitous consequences if we fail to curb the effects of climate change and curb the effects of it now. Madam Secretary, again, I applaud the steps that the Obama administration, under your leadership, has already taken to reduce our nation's global footprint. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your comments on the latest IPCC report, as well as the constructive ways we can address this urgent issue right now. Thank you, and with that, I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Tonko.
Wait a minute, Mr. You're out of time, Mr. I went 21 seconds over. You've gone a minute and 10 seconds over because we only had 3 minutes.
Well, I ask for unanimous consent that my colleague, Mr. Tonko, be given 2 minutes for an opening statement.
He'll get 3. No, okay, he'll get 3 then.
3 minutes.
Yeah, he'll get 3.
But you're most gracious.
You're welcome. I'm glad you're back, by the way.
Thank you.
This time I recognize this is a joint hearing, so he gets his 3 minutes. You went a minute over, and I went 21 seconds over, and now I'm going to recognize Mr. Shimkus for his 3 minutes.
And I'll try to be punctual. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Administrator McCarthy, and thank you for appearing today. I plan to focus my comments and later my questions on programs within my subcommittee's jurisdiction. Your authorities under the Safe Drinking Water Act and Solid Waste Disposal Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act, and the Superfund all come under the Environment and the Economy Subcommittee. These programs touch the lives of almost every American citizen. On several issues, EPA and our subcommittee have worked together closely and successfully on a bipartisan basis to solve problems. For example, with your support, we enacted eManifest in October 2012 to set up an electronic reporting program for hazardous materials under RCRA. Once we got consensus around the basic policy, we had to negotiate the complex thickets of budget rules, but we finally got it through the House and Senate and to the President for signature. We are looking for a good progress report on eManifest today. In another example, on drinking water, we worked with you and in the end, last year to solve the problem you identified involved fire hydrants. In record time, we were able to agree on the scope of the issue and draft legislation and move it through Congress to the President's desk. As a result, water system managers and firefighters across America never had to face the terrible dilemma whether or not to keep a hydrant out of service just to comply with a restriction that none of us intended to impose. So with those two solutions under our belts, let's turn together to TSCA reform. Just in the last 10 months, I've convened 6 hearings on TSCA. In February, we released a discussion draft of a modernization bill. We've gotten comments from a wide range of stakeholders. EPA has given us some valuable but preliminary technical assistance, but many large policy issues still remain unresolved. We want to resolve those with you, and we hope you share our ambition and sincere desire to make this a collaborative process. Our founding fathers never said it would be easy getting agreement among the President and the majority of the House and the Senate, but that's no reason not to try. We look forward to working closely with you on these and other issues to protect our citizens' health and their way of life. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. This time I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for his 3-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning. As we know, we are here to discuss the fiscal year 2015 budget request for the Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome, Administrator McCarthy, and thank you for being here today. And more importantly, thank you for your tremendous leadership of a very important agency. I, however, regret that I find the administration's budget request for your agency disappointing. A budget does more than lay out the annual priorities for the current year's work. It is, or it should be, a statement about what we aspire to for the future. This budget is not very inspiring. There are many unmet needs in communities across this great country. When I visit towns across my district, I see the need, and I think we should be addressing that need. We have been cruising along on investments that our parents' generation made in this country. They invested in the infrastructure to deliver clean, safe drinking water that's delivered to American homes across this country. There should be no question that we maintain that level of service, not reduce our commitment. Water is basic to everything we do in our daily lives and in our economy. Water is essential for agriculture, for fisheries, for recreation, manufacturing, transportation, energy development, and yes, for daily living. The 2013 infrastructure report card produced by the American Society of Civil Engineers gave our nation a D on drinking water infrastructure, and that D was not meant to stand for delightful. New York State, by their estimates, will require an investment of $27 billion over the next 2 years, or the next 2 decades. There are other states facing that same situation. That's a huge need. In addition to the backlog of infrastructure repair and replacement, we also need to redesign some of our infrastructure to withstand the new conditions we will face due to climate change. So we cannot maintain our edge as a nation in this 21st century with infrastructure from the 19th and 20th centuries in need of repair. We could be putting many people to work rebuilding the infrastructure to support our modern society and maintain a strong and vibrant economy. There are some important initiatives underway as part of the President's Climate Action Plan, and I'm supportive of that. I'm very encouraged by it, but we could do much better for our citizens and for future generations. I want to work with you to make the federal government a stronger partner with state and local governments in reducing the backlog of infrastructure projects. We all want to ensure that tax dollars are spent efficiently and effectively, but doing more with less is not going to address a situation where need is growing. It is not a sustainable strategy, and it will not deliver the 21st century infrastructure that we need. My question, why put investment off? Infrastructure problems cost money, and the longer projects are delayed, the higher the cost to restore services. Administrator McCarthy, I know you believe that environmental protection and economic development go hand in hand. I've seen you in action. I know you're committed. I want to work with you to continue to demonstrate the power of that combination. And again, I thank you for appearing before this joint committee hearing. I yield back.
This time I recognize the gentleman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. Welcome. Now, I want to begin, as I did last year, by acknowledging and applauding the success of our nation's efforts to protect and improve our environment over the years. Under existing regulations, our air quality has improved dramatically. This is something that our entire country should be proud of. EPA reports that total emissions of toxic air pollutants decreased by approximately 42% between 1990 and 2005, And then between 1980 and 2010, total emissions of the 6 principal air pollutants dropped by 63%. I want to commend EPA's efforts to resolve issues such as Superfund cleanups. Particularly appreciative of your focus, along with my 2 senators, on the Kalamazoo River, particularly the Allied site, and look forward to getting that project accomplished. And total removal may well turn out to be the most cost-effective solution in the long run. But in spite of the success over the last few decades, I do have some concern over EPA's regulatory trajectory. The number and scope of EPA's regulations is continuing to grow without precedent. This administration is seeking to regulate sometimes where they failed to legislate, and that pace has continued with the release of several major rules that impose, indeed, billions of dollars in costs with somewhat questionable benefits. These rules continue to threaten not only electric reliability and affordability, but they certainly shake up the confidence in the manufacturing renaissance underway. EPA continues to regulate too much, too fast. No wonder so many job-creating companies are holding back on new investment. They not only face rising energy and compliance costs, but also uncertainty as to what those new regs are going to require. The worst of EPA's regulatory agenda may yet to come, especially with the greenhouse gas regs for power plants. We have yet to see fully what EPA plans to propose for these new existing, or excuse me, not new, but for existing power plants, or the full impact on consumers' electric bills and unemployment. But if we allow that agenda to continue without the proper oversight, we may well see higher costs, more jobs lost, and widespread problems. We get constant reassurances from the administration that costs are minimal and benefits always trump costs when it comes to EPA's regs. Of course, the health law was also rolled out with a host of assurances that certainly fell woefully short. Many EPA rules were introduced with the same kind of rosy economic promises, and while they're proving to be just as detached from reality. When I meet with manufacturers, I usually hear about the problems with the health law and, yes, problems with EPA. Both threaten job and global competitiveness, and do so at a time when low energy prices are finally giving American manufacturing an edge. Administrator McCarthy, you were recently quoted in the New York Times saying that you want to avoid a repeat of the Obamacare rollout debacle. I fear that it may be too late, but I certainly hope that we can work together to limit any further damage. And again, welcome. We appreciate your testimony. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for a 3-minute opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I might just make a note that the Obamacare brought in 7 million people and appears to be quite successful, despite the aspirations of our Republicans to trash it. Administrator McCarthy, I thank you very much for being here, and more importantly, thank you for your service to the nation at the Environmental Protection Agency. Since its inception, EPA has worked to make our air safer to breathe, our water safer to drink, and today EPA is on the front lines of effort to address the greatest environmental challenge of our time, climate change. Administrator McCarthy, Americans are counting on you to carry out the President's Climate Action Plan and cut dangerous carbon pollution. Earlier this week, the world scientists sounded an alarm once again to alert us of the high stakes if we fail to take immediate action on climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released a new report on the impacts of climate change, the future risks from a changing climate, and opportunities for action to mitigate those risks. This new IPCC report concludes that the effects of climate change are evident on all continents and in all oceans. To learn about that report and what scientists have to say, we have to read the newspaper, because our committee will not hold a hearing with scientists to hear from them directly. Climate change is not something we can have the luxury to worry about at some time in the future. It's already here. And the longer we wait to respond, the more pervasive, severe, and irreversible the impacts will be. The IPCC concludes sea level rise threatens coastal areas with flooding and erosion. The oceans will grow more acidic, threatening fisheries and those who depend on them for their livelihoods. Extreme weather events will become more frequent, threatening lives as well as critical infrastructure. Heat waves will take more lives. No one will be immune from the consequences of climate change, but the impacts will be especially severe for those who are least able to respond and adapt. I know you understand this and are committed to making the Environmental Protection Agency one of the world's leaders in the effort to protect families from dangerous climate change. I want you to know that I'm committed to supporting your efforts. EPA does not often get a warm welcome in the House of Representatives. Don't take it personally. In fact, the House has voted 194 times in the last 3 years to undermine the agency, 478 times to weaken fundamental environmental protections. That's a testament to how out of touch Congress has become and to the vast influence of the special interests. It is no way a reflection on the quality of your work at EPA, which has been so superb. So I hope you will continue to do exactly what you have been doing, which is taking forceful, reasonable steps to protect the environment for our children and future generations. Families across America are counting on you to do what is right and to stand up to special interests that seem to be vocal in this institution, that those special interests would endanger our future. Yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Waxman. Now, at this time, Ms. McCarthy, I'll recognize you for your 5-minute opening statement, and understand you're accompanied today by the acting CFO, Ms. Froelich. Welcome. We're thrilled that you're here with us this morning, and it'll be a joyful morning. So, at this time, Ms. McCarthy, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, also Chairman Simkus, ranking members, Rush and Tonko. It's great to be
Would
here.
you mind just pulling the microphone a little bit closer?
Sure. Is that better? Let's hope I don't blow you away later. But it's great to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss EPA's proposed fiscal year 2015 budget. I am joined by Mary Ann Froelich, who's the agency's acting CFO. EPA's budget request is $7.89 billion for the fiscal year 15, starting October 1st, 2014. This budget meets the challenge of domestic spending constraints while still fulfilling our mission to protect public health and the environment. The fiscal year 2015 budget reflects EPA's plans to take advantage of new technologies and new regulatory and non-regulatory approaches. It recognizes that EPA is part of a larger network of environmental partners in our states, our tribes, and our communities. This budget will provide the support for a smaller workforce by focusing on real progress in priority areas, communities, climate change and air quality, toxics and chemical safety, as well as clean water. We're asking for $7.5 million and 64 staff in fiscal year 2015 to help provide green infrastructure, technical assistance for up to 100 communities to promote cost-effective approaches for water management. In addition, this budget request continues our environmental justice efforts. We will do more to partner with states, tribes, and local governments and other federal agencies. Funding for state and tribal assistance grants, or our STAG funds, are once again the largest percentage of the EPA's budget. Addressing the threat from climate change is one of the greatest challenges of this and future generations. The request designates $199.5 million specifically for this work. The agency has added $10 million and 24 FTEs in fiscal year 2015 to support the President's Climate Action Plan, with $2 million designated for adaptation planning. The agency will also focus resources on the development of common sense and achievable greenhouse gas standards for power plants, the single largest source of carbon pollution. When it comes to cutting greenhouse gas emissions, the President's budget provides support for the states to help them implement the Clean Air Act. The EPA's budget requests almost $673 million to support work to improve chemical safety for all Americans, and especially our children. We're requesting $23 million and 24 FTE in fiscal year 15 to support activities under the President's executive order on chemical safety, as well as agency efforts on chemical prioritization, air toxics, radon, and volatile organic compounds in drinking water. The nation's water resources are the lifeblood of our communities. We're requesting $1.775 billion for the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. The agency is also directing $8 million and 10 FTE to advance clean water infrastructure and sustainable design, like the Municipal Stormwater Sewer System Program for technical support to communities. E-Enterprise is a major joint initiative between EPA and the states to modernize our business practices and to look towards the future. The benefits of implementing just the one initiative, the e-manifest system, includes annual savings estimated at $75 million for over 160,000 waste handlers. In fiscal year 2015, the agency is requesting over $1.33 billion to continue to apply effective approaches for cleanup under RCRA, Superfund, leaking underground storage tanks, and other authorities. This strategy will ensure land is returned to beneficial use. $1.16 billion is requested for Superfund, which includes a $43.4 million increase for remedial work and an increase of $9.2 million for emergency response and removal. The fiscal year 2015 budget includes a total of $1.13 billion in categorical grants. Within that total is over $96 million for tribal assistance program grants, an $18 million increase for pollution control, a $16 million increase for environmental information grants, and a $15 million increase for state and local air quality management. Science is the foundation of EPA's work, and science is supported in this budget at $537.3 million. And lastly, recognizing the importance of the two-year budget agreement Congress reached in December, we are expanding opportunities to all Americans as best we can, but the levels are not sufficient to expand them to all or to grow the economy in ways that we would like. For that reason, across the federal government, the budget also includes a separate, fully paid-for $56 billion initiative. Within this initiative is a climate resilience fund, which includes $10 million for protecting and enhancing coastal wetlands and $5 million to support urban forest enhancement and protection. Chairmans Whitfield and Shimkus, I thank you for the opportunity to testify and also to take your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. McCarthy. As I said, we appreciate your being here, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes questions. Under your new source performance standards for new electric utility generating units, you specifically set the emission standards based on 3 plants in the United States, one in Mississippi, one in Texas, one in California. The one in Texas has not been They've not even started construction. The one in California, they've not even started construction. The one in Mississippi is being constructed. It's not in operation yet. None of them would be built without funding from the federal government and our tax credits under the Clean Coal Power Initiative. And the 2005 Energy Policy Act specifically says you cannot, if a facility is receiving funds from the Clean Coal Power Initiative, you cannot say that it's been adequately demonstrated. And we wrote a letter to you back in November asking your legal justification for doing this. We still have not heard from you all. We've talked to lawyers outside the Congress, inside the Congress, and everyone genuinely believes that the 2005 Act explicitly prohibits you from setting an emission standard if it's receiving funds from the Clean Coal Power Initiative. So what is how can you proceed with this, and what are your lawyers telling you? And do you intend to respond to our letter?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I did listen to you when we spoke last time, and we received your letter. We did respond by including a notice of data availability that is in the Federal Register, which really explains the impact of EPAC on this proposal and the fact that we did fully consider it. We did have a very robust record to indicate that CCS was actually technically achievable and available the way the law requires.
And no private company is going to build one of those plants without money. You know, the Mississippi plant has a serious cost overrun. The chairman of Southern has said this would not have been built without government support.
Mr. Chairman, the EPAC requires that we not rely solely on those funded projects out of DOE to establish these standards. We have a very robust record, well beyond those few facilities, to indicate that CCS is
Well, you know, that's the
technologically
government's
achievable.
position, but the CEOs of private companies that have a responsibility investing say that there is no technology available to them to meet the emission standard that you all are setting in this new rule. And the reason we get upset about it is, I mean, most people recognize Europe as the green energy capital of the world. 22% of their electricity comes from renewables. And yet, even in Europe, where they've, in the last 20 months, have mothballed 30 gigawatts of new gas-powered plants because the gas coming from Russia is so expensive. And as you know, their unemployment rate is even higher than ours, and their economy is more sluggish than ours is. But yet, last year, they imported 53% of our coal exports from America. 53% went to Europe because when the gas prices went so high, they recognized they have to rely on coal. And under this rule, we don't have that flexibility. So what if our gas prices go high? What kind of where are we going to be left in America trying to compete in the global marketplace when we can't even build a new coal-powered plant?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think we've indicated many times that this country is relying on coal. Coal will be part of the energy mix for decades to come. We know where investment is heading in new coal facilities, and all of them that you're talking about, while some of them have received DOE funding, they are all relying on advancing CCS, recognizing that they're going to be around for decades. and that
CCS
climate
is so
change
far
is
off, I'm
inevitable.
telling you. I mean, it is not anywhere near commercially viable. So, you know, I guess there's no sense my continuing to press this point, but I tell you what, those people who are involved in the utility business tell us explicitly that they cannot build a new coal-powered plant and meet these emission standards. And I think that America is being jeopardized by this kind of action. And I suppose, even though you and I have great respect for each other, and I love dealing with you, it's just an area where we have serious disagreements. So.
I understand. Well, Mr. Chairman, we did try to address concerns. This proposal actually requires only partial CCS. It's an ability to move this technology forward and to recognize that it is an opportunity for coal.
But all of this is being used for enhanced oil recovery, and there are many places where we need plants, and enhanced oil recovery cannot play a part in it. My time's expired. I'm sorry. At this time, I recognize Mr. Rush for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator McCarthy, there's a lot of talk about cutting carbon pollution, and the other side don't ever want to talk about cutting the cost of, or they think that the cost of climate change is zero. They don't ever want to own up to the fact that there's an economic price that we're paying and will continue to pay for the problems with climate change. And I want to zero in from the general to the specific. I'm concerned that the risk and cost of climate change, that it would hit the poorest and most vulnerable especially hard. I'd like for you to give me your view on how does climate change multiply risk for people who are already struggling with hunger and with poverty. And what are some of the impacts of climate change that you're most concerned about, particularly for low-income communities? And as you know, we noted earlier that the IPCC issued a report saying that climate change impacts are projected to slow down economic growth, make poverty reduction more difficult, further erode food security, and prolong existing and create new poverty traps. So, Madam Administrator, talk to us a little bit about how climate change is going to impact our nation and the world most needy and most disadvantaged.
Thank you, Ranking Member. The real threat of climate change is inaction to address the problem. We have seen storms, we have seen intense storms, we have seen droughts, we have seen fires that are out of control. Many of these results of a changing climate were anticipated and predicted by the IPC when they first started gathering. And the fifth assessment they just released indicates that what they predicted and feared is actually what we're experiencing now. And they predict that that will only get worse. And they also make the point that in addition to already large costs that this country and others are facing as a result of a changing climate and those impacts, that the most vulnerable populations, the poor, those living in coastal areas, those most unable to get up and move and protect themselves, that are going to be hurt the most. That's true in the U.S., and that's true internationally as well.
You respond to those who say the U.S. shouldn't do anything to cut carbon pollution unless other countries do something also, unless they act first even?
Well, I think the reason that President Obama has put out a climate action plan is to have the U.S. show leadership in the international community, as well as to recognize that the things you need to do to address climate change can be enormously beneficial to the economy. If you're smart about the actions you've taken, if you use existing authority, you do it legally and technically correct, you can generate reductions in electricity generation and demand that will reduce carbon emissions, that will save people money, issues like energy efficiency, switch to renewable energy. This is the clean energy future, not relying on the clean energy past.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield back the minute that I used earlier, so we are even now.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Rush. And at this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. McCarthy, it's always good to see you.
You too.
Before I begin to give you a hard time, let me give you a compliment. I think you and your agency have been as compliant or as cooperative as you can on the renewable fuel standard and some of those problems. And I want to thank you and the agency for trying to show some flexibility there. Now I have to be a little less friendly. I'm going to follow up on what Chairman Whitfield commented on. I was chairman of this committee in 2005 when we passed the Energy Policy Act, and I was chairman of the conference committee. And I had a good friend named John Dingell, who is still a good friend, and there was the ranking member of the Energy and Power Subcommittee, a young man named Rick Boucher, who's no longer in the Congress, but was a very, very hard-working congressman from Virginia. And they wanted to do something on clean coal technology, especially Rick Boucher. I know Mr. Griffith is here, and he replaced Mr. Boucher, so we've got a very good replacement in Mr. Griffith. But we put in a section to fund some research projects for clean coal technology, and I'm going to read part of the section, Section 402, Project Criteria. This is actually from the law, Public Law 10958. To be eligible to receive assistance under this subtitle, a project shall advance efficiency, environmental performance, and cost competitiveness well beyond the level of technologies that are in commercial service or have been demonstrated on a scale that the Secretary determines is sufficient to demonstrate that commercial service is viable as of the date of enactment of this Act. Well beyond the level of technologies that are in commercial service. That's Section 402A. If you come over a little bit further on in the section, and you get into how to actually apply it. And in subtitle I, applicability, no technology or level of emission reduction solely by reason of the use of the technology or the achievement of emission reduction by one or more facilities receiving assistance under this act shall be considered to be adequately demonstrated for purposes of Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, 42 U.S. Code 7411. And that is the new source performance review section of the Clean Air Act. So it's explicitly clear that in funding these demonstration projects, whatever their level of CO2 reduction is, that is not supposed to be used to set the new source performance review standards. Yet when your agency put out the proposed regulation on those standards, they referred to these projects, not one of which is in operation, none of which are even close to being operable except for the plant down in Mississippi, and it's behind schedule and over budget. Now, you are an intelligent woman. I think you're an honest woman. I think you're an able administrator. How can, in good conscience, you allow these new emission standards to be promulgated when they're based on technology that hasn't been demonstrated yet, and by law says you can't use these emission standards from these these demonstration projects because they're not in commercial operation? I mean, Mr. Whitfield is agog, and I have to join him.
Well, Congressman, our understanding of EPACT is that EPA shouldn't be relying solely on our determination of what is the best system of emission reduction under 111, just solely on the basis of EPACT-funded projects. But we can look at them in the context of a larger and more robust technical and scientific record, and that's essentially what we're doing. We know that CCS has been used and is being used at the commercial scale in other industries. It has been for many years. The technology is available. Each component of that technology has been in use, has been tested, and is viable. And so we are looking at these larger projects that are full-scale power plants that are under construction or being developed within the context of that larger and more robust context.
Well, my time has expired. I took too long asking the question. I have some other questions for the record, and I'll submit those. But we're not going to go away on this.
This time, I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Administrator, again, welcome.
Thank you.
Residents in my home state of New York and all along the East Coast saw last year just how devastating superstorms can be. As sea levels rise and storms become more violent, storm surges will pose risk further and further inland. In 2011, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, which I had the honor of leading before I came to Congress, completed an authoritative report on the impacts of climate change in New York State. According to that report, climate change will lead to the propagation of storm surges up the Hudson River and will move the saltwater front further and further upstream. This will impair drinking water systems that draw water from the Hudson and could potentially contaminate the backup water supply of New York City. This year's budget request calls for realigning resources to provide technical assistance to water utilities at greatest risk from storm surges. So my question to you, Administrator, is can you elaborate on EPA's efforts to assist these at-risk water systems?
Sure. In the President's Climate Action Plan, he created a resiliency task force specifically to look at what the best practices were that we're seeing across the country in adapting to a changing climate. So we are not only working nationally and across the U.S. to identify these projects and to get the lessons learned out, but we're also specifically focusing on some ways in which you can address adaptation to climate that also enhances your ability to protect water cost effectively. That's what we call green infrastructure. That is a way of actually looking at embracing water that's coming in, managing it appropriately, and preventing the stormwater surges and the sewer overflows that we see have long-lasting impacts on both our pocketbooks as well as the health of our communities.
Thank you. Technical assistance and tools are only part of the solution. Water systems in New York will have to adapt, potentially moving intakes and infrastructure at great cost. And they are not alone. The drinking water infrastructure needs facing our cities and towns continue to grow and will grow significantly with climate adaptation costs. EPA's most recent survey of drinking water infrastructure needs, released in June, showed $384 billion worth in drinking water infrastructure repairs needed over the next 20 years. That amount is a significant increase from the previous survey, demonstrating that investment in infrastructure is not keeping pace with need. Yet the budget request calls for only $757 million for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, a 16% decrease from this year's enacted levels. Administrator McCarthy, if more funds were made available through the SRF, could more be done to replace water infrastructure that is at the end of its useful life?
Yes, sir.
Well, is EPA considering alternatives to simply rebuilding or replacing the drinking water infrastructure that is in place? And do we have more cost-effective options available that could be applied?
Well, we are exploring cost-effective options so that we can stretch the dollars as much as possible and look at keeping the facilities we have in better operating condition. So we're looking not only at our fiscal realities of what funds we have to be able to support this efforts, but we're looking also at directing some of those funds towards these green infrastructure solutions, as well as paying a specific attention to small sources, so to small water systems that have particular challenges in terms of operating and generating and leveraging their own funds.
Okay. You know, the discussion not only with EPA but across the board for infrastructure, our deficient bridges to cite as an example, beyond EPA, there's just a need to invest in this country. And, you know, the longer we prolong in that investment, as I made in earlier comment, the more difficult it is going to be. So drinking water infrastructure is essential to our public health, and the need is acute. I think the amounts appropriated for the drinking water SRF should reflect that need and should be considerably higher than this request. I, again, would hope that this budget would not only suggest or invest in where we're at, but certainly where we want to be. And I would hope the goal is one that's robust in nature and one that reflects that if we don't do this now, we're going to pass it on to generations yet unborn. And I believe that morally that's incorrect, and certainly financially it's ineffective. I thank you very much again.
Gentleman yields back. This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mrs. McCartney, I don't totally agree with Mr. Barton's description of your history of dealing with businesses that are in trouble or that you deem in trouble. And I know you well remember that when I was chairman of Science, Space, and Technology before my committee, and it's something I'm not even going to mention, that you said you're not in the business of creating jobs. And it's my hope that the EPA would at least not stand in the way of job creation at this time. It's so important. As you have to know, abundance of natural gas supplies have opened up the possibility of the United States to be a manufacturing renaissance almost. And in his State of the Union, this speech, your president said, quote, business plan to invest almost $100 billion in new factories to use natural gas, unquote. He said, I'll cut red tape to help these states to get these factories built. Are you familiar with the president's statement during the State of Union?
Yes, I am.
And has the president directed EPA to help get these factories built?
Yes, he has.
And to use some degree of science when making decisions that affects these jobs?
Yes.
And what steps is EPA taking to cut that red tape?
Actually, he has provided some additional funding that's proposed in the fiscal year 2015 budget.
You just added more
Helps.
money on it, no more
No,
suggestions?
No, it's actually to allow both us and states to work together hand in hand to look at how we get these cleaner facilities up and operating more quickly and through the permit process.
Well, then, in that case, when and what steps is EPA taking to cut the red tape?
Well, we're working very hard to coordinate
I
with
know
our
you're working
states.
hard, but what steps are you taking?
We're working through a normal process of collaborating with the states to identify ways in which we can work together and provide technical assistance and get these permits up and running in a way that they're legally defensible and they also meet the requirements of the law.
According to the World Bank and International Finance Corporation's, quote, ease of doing business, unquote, index, the United States ranks 34th in the world in the category of dealing with construction permits. You aware of that?
I'm not aware of that figure, sir, no.
For reconstruction permits under the Clean Air Act's, quote, prevention of significant deterioration,
Yes.
or PSD as you all call it, the application process can take at least 1 year, correct?
It can, yes.
And it takes that, does it not?
That's the prescribed timeline in the Clean Air Act.
And there can be an administrative appeals process that lasts an additional 6 months or more, correct?
There can be appeals, and usually that appeal is productive in keeping things out of the court, which can end up going considerably longer.
Is EPA taking any steps to expedite the process for obtaining pre-construction permits under the PSD program? And if yes, what are those steps?
We have taken recent steps, but one of the most important things that we've done is we provide guidance to states on how states are dealing with their permits, how they can take advantage of issues that have been resolved elsewhere. So as they're drafting their permits, they're more solid. They understand that they won't be technically challenged and those challenges won't be successful. So we're working together to try to share information.
Well,
and make this
I hope
happen
you
more
are.
quickly.
In Arkansas, not far from my district in Texas, is the John W. Turk plant. It uses, and listen to this, advanced ultra supercritical technology and is one of the cleanest and most highly efficient coal plants in the world. It came online in December of 2012. Are you familiar with the Turk plant?
Somewhat, not.
Have you not visited it?
Say it again?
Have you not visited the Turk
I
plant?
have not, no.
One this important as you make these steps that you're taking?
Well, I'm sure I have folks that have been there, but that's not a trip I have yet made.
Could the Turk plant be built under the proposed standards for new coal plants that you signed last September?
I'm not familiar with what its output is in terms of its carbon pollution. I do know that ultra supercritical can be very, very efficient, and they also can be easily adapted to look at whether or not carbon capture and sequestration is available. So I can't answer this definitively, and I certainly will for you.
All right,
But
and I appreciate
my sense is
that.
it may be close, but probably not there in
Thank you
terms
for that.
of
My
what new
time's
facilities
running out. I just
require.
want to know what specifically does EPA believe the Turk plant could do to further reduce its carbon dioxide emissions? Because you're all about that regulation, are you not?
Well, sir, the carbon capture and sequestration is only for new facilities. It's not intended to be a measure of performance for existing facilities.
I thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Hall, I might just say I've been to the Turk plant and I've been told they cannot meet the new emission standards of the new source. New
Well,
plant.
I think that's very sad.
At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from, who's next? Green. Yeah, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
We need to make sure we're in line. One, I want to thank the chair and the ranking member of our both Energy and Environmental Subcommittees for holding this joint hearing. It's on the EPA budget. And I want to thank our EPA administrator for coming to Houston a few weeks ago. I did not realize that was the first time an EPA administrator had come to the CERNA Energy Conference. And of course, there's no shortage of energy conference in Houston, but that's one of the major ones, and I appreciate you being there. Like a lot of my colleagues, I have concern with the agency's budget proposal, particularly regarding the cuts in Superfund and SRF funding. program's of great importance to our industrial and blue-collar areas like I have in Houston and East Harris County. Administrator McCarthy, because in Texas, the state didn't agree to issue the GHG permitting, the EPA had to implement the federal implementation plan during that time. And we have a significant backlog was created when EPA had to issue the permits. When pending NSPS rules for power plants, does the EPA expect opposition again from permitting of these, from the states permitting of these plants?
No, it seems to be going well. We did have concerns in Texas, and as you know, Congressman, you've been calling us about some of those permits, and we're working to advance the backlog. But we're working hand in hand with TCEQ to make this transition as smooth as possible, and we seem to be working well together.
Okay. Does the EPA have a plan for effectively implementing a federal implementation plan, if that's an issue? I don't know if it's in other states or is it just Texas?
I think we have no plans at this time. Things are going well.
Does the agency plan to address permitting with my concern is a further reduction in staff and confined resources. How does the agency going to handle that with reduced staff under the President's budget and resources?
Well, we're looking at a number of different types of approaches, both that we would use through voluntary measures and others to monitor facilities more effectively using new technologies so that we can make sure that we keep abreast of compliance issues. We're going to work hard, and we're going to figure out how we can use new technologies and practices to do the work that we need to do. There's no question that it's challenging to keep up with the workload, and I don't doubt that. But there is a reality in the budget that we're trying to face here, and we're trying to change the way we do business so that we're as effective as we've always been.
And in our area, you know, a delay of even longer keeps those permits from being issued, but they also keep those jobs from being created in our community.
But we are shifting also, sir, to some in our priority areas where we know that there's increased work. The President did increase our budget for climate-related activities. He's supporting additional funds for the state in that effort so that any work that we can anticipate escalating will get the necessary resources. So we have budgeted additional funds for that.
Okay. Let me get back to the Superfund in the budget request. We have several Superfund sites both in and around our congressional district, including U.S. oil recovery in Pasadena, Texas, San Jacinto River waste pits, which is on the San Jacinto River just east of our district now, and the Cavalcade Street, which is older. Unfortunately, this year's budget's Superfund request is the lowest in the last 12 years. I know Superfund has been a priority for EPA. Do we know why the program was cut?
Yeah, sir, the Superfund program has been enormously valuable, and the President's fiscal year budget requests $1.157 billion, which is really a maintenance budget. We would like to be able to increase that, but given fiscal realities, we're trying to make the best of our budget situation.
So under the FY budget proposal, the EPA would not have any money for new starts or new cleanups?
I don't know the answer to that question. Let me get back to you on it.
Okay. What are the consequences of the sequestration cuts to the Superfund in FY 13 and 14? Was EPA able to begin any new projects during that period of time?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
The sequestration cuts to the Superfund in fiscal year 13 and 14, was EPA able to bring any new projects on during that period of time?
I'll get back to you on that as well, sir.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I know I'm almost down to end of time, so I appreciate your courtesy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this time, I recognize Mr. Upton, the chairman, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, and welcome again. As you may know, there are a couple of subcommittees meeting today at the same time, so we're moving back and forth. I really have just 2 questions, so let me ask them both and let you respond, and then I'll yield back. One is a Michigan issue, and as you know, I have joined with both my 2 senators, Levin and Stabenow, to try and seek the full removal of PCBs at the Allied Superfund site there in Kalamazoo. And we're concerned a little bit about and we join the local community for sure. There are still a number of issues yet to be resolved for which the feasibility study failed to account, such as the lack of recent data and monitoring of wells on site, the availability of alternative remediation technologies, and the reuse and redevelopment options. Can you assure us that these outstanding issues are going to be addressed before EPA issues the preferred cleanup options, and specifically, how is EPA going to account for the community's redevelopment plans moving forward? That's question one. Question two is, you know, Mr. Waxman and I have worked with many members of this committee to try and drive a consensus position on the RFS issue. We've done 5 white papers, a number of hearings, obviously bipartisan. We're looking for EPA to do their job as well. However, in recent years, EPA has been late in finalizing the rule, and in fact, for 2014, EPA still has not finalized the rule, even though the deadline is usually November of the preceding year, as it is in this case. So when do you expect to finalize that RVO for 2014, and what are you doing to get back on schedule for 2015?
Okay, let me quickly answer your questions. We certainly, Congressman, have heard from you and a number of others about the Allied paper site, and I need to take a close look at that and look at a variety of alternatives. As you know, we're going to be preparing a final cleanup plan for the summer. In advance of that, we're going to have a hearing in the middle of April to take some more comment on this. We're going to look at more water sampling there, and we'll make sure that we listen to all the concerns and address them when we put that final cleanup plan together. And I appreciate all the concerns that all the Congress and Senate has indicated to us, but also the concerns of the communities around there. On RFS, we are hoping for a June timeline. If I can do it more quickly, I'd like to. We need to get those final levels out. We have certainly heard from many folks on the Hill here that they didn't appreciate some of the proposal that we put out, that they thought we could have done a better job. We got a lot of comment, a lot of good data came in, and we'll be taking advantage of that in the final proposal.
And do you think you'll be back somehow on schedule for 2015?
That is a very good question. Hope springs eternal.
You're not under oath.
I'm hoping we can do better. One of the things we tried to do with this proposal was to try to provide more certainty moving forward. I think these big fluctuations in the levels tend to provide uncertainty in the investment community, and we certainly don't want that to happen.
Thank you. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. At this time, recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On Monday, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released its multi-year report on the state of climate science. The world's leading scientists examined the peer-reviewed science and confirmed that climate change is already happening on, quote, all continents and across the oceans, and will get much worse if we do not act. The report has been called a tale of two futures, because we are at a crossroads. We have a choice to make. We can seize the moment by taking action to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and realize the benefits of transitioning to a clean energy economy. Or we can decide, Mr. Chairman, not to act. The result will be runaway climate change with reduced crop yields, more heat waves and disease, decreased water availability, more extreme weather events, and the mass extinction of many of the world's species. Administrator McCarthy, do you believe that there is an urgent need to act and that our actions now will determine whether we avoid the worst impacts of climate change?
I do, sir.
Yet we hear a litany of arguments for why we shouldn't act. Some opponents of action argue that humans are not causing climate change. Should this argument persuade us?
No, sir.
The IPCC says that there is at least a 95% chance that humans have been the dominant cause of observed warming. And yet that's not enough for this committee to feel the urgency. We've heard the claim that climate change has no cause. Does the science support this argument?
No, sir.
The IPC says that there will be significant economic impacts from sea level rise, flooding, extreme weather events, extreme heat, food insecurity, and reduced access to drinking water. We often hear the claim that the U.S. emissions in the energy sector are lower than they have been in recent years. The implication is that no further action to reduce emissions is required. According to the world's leading scientists, is this implication true? Are we on track to avoid the worst impacts of climate change?
No, we're not, sir.
Your answer is persuasive because much larger emission reductions are going to be required than we've been seeing recently, which is probably has a lot more to do with our economic decline during the difficult times. Opponents of action also argue that requiring coal-fired power plants to control their carbon pollution is part of a war on coal. Is that accurate? Is there any way we can reduce our emissions by enough to avoid the worst impacts of climate change without controlling carbon pollution from power plants?
Power plants are the largest source of stationary source of carbon, and it represents about a third of what we emit. It needs to be addressed.
The loudest voices against taking action have offered no alternative plan to protect our children and grandchildren from the ravages of climate change. Now, Mr. Chairman, it's time to choose our path. We could accept all of these excuses for inaction and do nothing. The result would be a climate catastrophe, or we can choose to act now to address climate change. Administrator McCarthy, you are proposing to take reasonable action to address this threat, and you have my full support. I'd be happy to yield to any of my colleagues on either side of the aisle because I have a minute left. If not, I'll yield it back. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, it's great to have you here, Administrator.
You too.
In January, EPA entered a settlement agreement regarding coal ash in which the EPA agreed to finalize the June 2010 proposed rule by December of this year.
That's right.
Will the agency meet that deadline?
Yes, we will.
Does the agency intend to finalize a rule under Subtitle D?
I can't answer that question, sir. The final proposal hasn't yet been developed.
You understand our concern with the Subtitle D issue in that
I certainly.
is our analysis, there's no statutory authority to implement an enforceable permit program. Does the agency have a strategy for addressing that issue?
Well, that's part of the consideration, the development of the final rule.
Thank you. And now I'm going to turn to TSCA, which we talked about a little bit before the hearing opened. What is the EPA budget to carry out TSCA in fiscal year 2015?
Let me take 1 minute to pull that out. Thanks.
And then the follow-up is, how does that compare to 2014?
EPA has identified $86.4 million and 332.6 FTE for the TSCA program in the fiscal year enacted budget. This request is $90.4 million and 321 FTE. So it is an increase, sir.
How many work plan chemicals has EPA completed action on so far, and how many in fiscal 2014?
We have issued 5 draft work plans for peer review. We're going to finalize those 5 in 2014. We have plans to release draft risk assessments for 19 additional by the close of 2015, and 10 of those are expected to have been made final.
Okay. Do you use current authority to collect user fees to carry out TSCA?
Yes, we actually, TSCA provides limited authority for us to collect user fees. It restricts the amount that we collect per submission, and it requires those funds to go to the Treasury.
And can you tell me, and if not, then later for the record, how much of the current budget is offset by user fees?
It does not go back to EPA, so I do not know. Oh, I'm sorry. I believe this year we anticipate $1.8 million is collected for new chemical submissions in a year. That's generally on average.
EPA reviewed some 1,200 chemicals in prioritizing 83 substances for the Work Plan Chemicals program. Does EPA have the expertise and the capability to prioritize substances in commerce for further review and assessment?
We have capability of doing that, yes.
And the follow-up here is how quickly can that prioritization be done?
I can get back to you, sir, but as you know, there are 10,000 chemicals. We're trying to deal with. The numbers we're talking about will not get us there, which is why we're looking at other capabilities and screening tools that we can develop.
Yeah, please talk. Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Obviously, I'm kind of deep in this debate.
Yeah.
So do you feel prioritization is critical in trying to resolve this backlog and really answer questions?
I think it is important because we have TSCA provides us some authority, certainly not to address the issue as robustly as we'd like. We're looking at new technologies for prioritization based on the information we have today. We're also looking at a new technology that we're working in a very robust and transparent way to look at a computerized toxicology screening process that people think there's great value in. We'll see. We're going through appropriate review of that.
Right.
But there has to be a better way for us to target our resources most effectively to protect public.
And the toxicologists are really asking for us to use sound science and our ability to do
Yes.
this. And I would encourage you as we work through this process, prioritization is, I think it's a have to, and this is something we can do. Let me just take my remaining 20 seconds to just, I live in the St. Louis metropolitan area, although this is really a Missouri issue, but since I'm on this committee, and I would also like for you just to take a quick look or get briefed, if you have not been, on the Bridgeton landfill and the Westlake landfill. The senators from the state of Missouri and my congressional colleagues, it's an interesting dilemma, and if you haven't been briefed on it, it probably is worth your while to do so.
Sounds fascinating.
I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to thank the administrator for serving at the EPA in a time of difficulty and sometimes hostility.
Opportunity as well, sir.
Section 319 of the Clean Air Act defines an event as an exceptional event if it affects air quality, if it's an event that is not reasonably controllable or preventable, and is an event caused by human activity. These are events which the EPA believes normal planning would not be applicable. And now California is in its third straight year of drought. Droughts tend to make air quality worse by having increased dust levels, by wildfires, and there's no water to wash that away. Are droughts included in the EPA's list of exceptional events?
The event itself is what we analyze, but we're certainly aware that drought can exacerbate these exceptional events, and we work with states to identify an opportunity to work together to actually excuse those, if you will, from being calculated as part of an attainment demonstration.
What length of time do you think the EPA would consider appropriate then when making an exception in this case, or these cases?
Well, we work with the states to identify what kind of data we need and then we work very hard to go through that data and provide decision points for them. We actually have done some really big improvements in how we work with states on these exceptional events, most notably wind events. We've recently completed a review of how we do the exceptional events, what data we require to streamline that, and we've been able to get off the books a number of uncertainties that the states were concerned about. We're going to be tackling other issues like fire as well in the future, so that we can make sure that we recognize that the climate's changing and we need a streamlined and more robust way of working on these issues together.
Good, thank you. On another subject, last week the administration announced an interagency methane strategy. One component involves reducing emissions from the coal and gas sectors. Why do you think it's important to reduce methane emissions?
Yeah, methane is a extremely intensive CO2 or carbon source of carbon pollution. and it's important for us to get at methane emissions, and it's also an opportunity to actually have some real impact in the short term over the changes we're seeing in climate. We are looking at, and the President released a methane strategy, and that's a strategy that goes across the U.S. government. And part of EPA's responsibility under that strategy is look at the methane that is being emitted from landfills in context of our Clean Air Act obligations. It's also looking at coal mines. It's also looking at unconventional oil and gas development and how we can continue to work together as we have before to take advantage of new technologies that make the capture of that methane more effective.
Are these new technologies cost-effective for the industry?
Well, we have already issued a new source performance standard that captures the volatile organic compounds in the emissions from unconventional gas when hydrofracking happens. Part of that captures the methane as well. It is very cost-effective. In fact, it is one of the few rules that EPA has done, at least in my tenure, that makes the obligated parties money.
Good.
It doesn't take it away because you can certainly reuse the methane and sell it.
Sure. Well, as you know, we've conducted 5 hearings on the Toxic Substance Control Act. In one hearing, every single witness agreed that decisions on chemical priority should be based on human health safety. Every single witness, 11 total. In your opinion, does the discussion draft, Chemicals in Commerce, put human health safety first, or are other considerations given higher prominence?
Congressman, EPA hasn't done a complete assessment of any of the rules so far, but we are providing technical assistance to both the Senate and Congress on this issue. We'll continue to do that, and we certainly have issued principles that put public health first, and we'd be evaluating consistent with those principles.
Well, it's important that the EPA have the authority, in my opinion, to evaluate chemicals. Would you agree that providing EPA with the necessary information of a chemical be mandatory before allowing it to enter commerce?
That is the law now, and I believe that it should remain the law, yes.
Very good. How can Congress best ensure that the EPA is provided with the resources it needs to test and classify these chemicals?
Well, we're requesting continued assistance in our under the current TSCA rule. We're also looking at developing new tools, as I indicated before, to prioritize. We need resources to be able to do that. And we're encouraged that Congress is looking at TSCA with some seriousness, but we certainly know that there's a long way to go before we can rely on a new rule, and we have work to do in the meantime, and we'll keep doing it.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And coming from Nebraska, I'm going to have a little bit of an ag angle. So the first question is, I read with interest over the weekend a new proposed dairy rule regarding dairy operations and methane. And I was just wondering if in the proposed methane, to reduce methane emissions by 25% by 2020. You have a look like you don't know that, but it was an article that was in Friday and Saturday's papers.
I'm sorry, I did look a little befuddled.
Yeah.
I apologize. Everything that I think comes out my face. I was a little befuddled.
I share the same trait.
Thankfully, you're not referring to anything that EPA has proposed. I do know that as part of the methane strategy, the USDA has identified a number of ways in which they think they can work with the dairy industry. We have been working with them all along on
the article
digesters.
said EPA was involved.
Only to the extent that we work in a voluntary program, not a regulation, to work with the farming community and agriculture, particularly dairy, where there are opportunities to have methane digesters so that you can recapture the methane, and they tend to use it for electricity generation on site.
Yeah, and I've seen some nice...
It's entirely voluntary, not a rulemaking.
Okay. And there's a couple of concerns with that I'll lay out. So as part of that, and one of the concerns deals with the smaller dairy operations, because a digester they're very expensive. And so the feedback that I received over the weekend and on Monday was that if you're a dairy operation of about 300 head, then you can't meet that. And so I just want to put on the table that requiring, because mostly when farmers hear voluntary, they know it's followed up with mandatory. That's their.
Well,
you may be able to come up with instances.
I know
not,
I should
but
never speak for one of my colleagues on the cabinet, but I think I can safely speak for Secretary Vilsack that he is really talking about a collaborative process to take a look at how we can assist the dairy industry in this venture. No one at this point that I know of is talking about anything in a regulatory context.
I hope not. I appreciate that, but
Me too.
That's something I would resist. In that regard, then also one of the other issues that's brought up a lot is the groundwater, and there is some proposed rule that is viewed in our ag industry and by me as another way to get at water runoff. There's a list of 50 rules that they can use to comply, and again, it's voluntary, as I understand. But explain how that works, because it sounds like a backwards way of just trying to get around two previous Supreme Court decisions.
No, it's actually trying to implement them. It's called the Waters of the U.S., and we can spend some time on this if you like, and I'd be happy to talk to your community on this. But I think we did a pretty good job. Number one, we made it very clear it does not regulate groundwater. That's not its business. It's clearly stated. For the same reasons you're raising it, is to address those concerns. And the 50 practices are actually agricultural practices that we're defining as exempt from the jurisdiction of the waters of the U.S. And we're inviting a process for more of those to be identified. So we're doing the best we can to identify and to provide more certainty while allowing farmers to do the work they need to do for all of us.
Yeah, they would disagree with the certainty of what they have to do now. The other part is last week in a hearing there was a question about whether or not the agricultural exemptions apply to Section 404 or 402. Have you been able to clarify that for us as well?
Yes, 404 only.
404 only.
Yes.
Very good. This is a little snarky, but it comes up a lot.
Okay.
What's the budget to rent for planes to fly over feedlots in Nebraska?
First of all, we don't do drones, so the budget for that is zero. We do use flyovers at times basically as a screening mechanism. I do not know what those budgets are, sir.
All right. Thank you. I yield back my 4 seconds.
The gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Administrator McCarthy, thank you for your testimony and for being here today. I have a couple topics for sure I'd like to get on the table, and the first one is offshore fracking.
Yes.
As you know, numerous fracks have taken place from offshore platforms in federal waters off the coast of California in recent years. Many of these fracks have been in the sensitive waters of the Santa Barbara Channel, which is in my congressional district. While we know very little about the impacts of onshore fracking, we really know far less about offshore. And that's why I called on the EPA and the Department of the Interior last November to place a moratorium on these offshore activities until a comprehensive environmental review is conducted and considered. I know EPA included new disclosure requirements in its most recent discharge permit for these offshore platforms, and I commend you for taking this important step. But this is the catch right now. Much more is needed, and under this new general permit, operators only need to report the type and amount of chemicals in their wastewater after it's already been discharged into the ocean. As a result, regulators like EPA and the California Coastal Commission cannot review these discharges on a case-by-case basis in anticipation of the fracking happening rather than after the fact. Administrator McCarthy, would you consider modifying this discharge permit to require a case-by-case review of these fracking discharges?
Well, the general permit that we issued under the law allows us to reconsider that and take a look at new data. We're more than happy to work with you. We think that the general permit that we put out was a sensible approach given the authority that we have under the law. It also requires that there's certain standards that are achieved in this effluent that's emitted that may contain hydrofracking, that is appropriately tested to ensure that it doesn't damage aquatic life. But if you have concerns, we're always available to sit down and talk through those. And if changes are necessary, the law allows changes to be made.
Great, and I do look forward to that. I think such a modification would be important, and look forward to continued discussion on that topic. Here is another topic. Climate change, as you know, is already having serious impacts on our environment, on our infrastructure, and on our public health. Representing a coastal district, as I do, I'm particularly concerned by one of climate change's lesser understood impacts, ocean acidification.
Yes.
The coastal communities in my district depend on healthy oceans and coastal ecosystems for their livelihoods, for recreation, and much more. So changing ocean chemistry, particularly in the coastal zone where much of this economic activity takes place, has a direct impact on my constituents. The just released IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on climate change, highlighted several factors, including runoff and other pollution, that are magnifying the impacts of ocean acidification at the local level. What is EPA doing to identify coastal areas that are of particular risk for ocean acidification? And if you can, tell us what is being done or can be done to help make these communities more resilient going forward.
Yeah. I think one of the most important messages from the recent IPCC, other than the increasing certainty around the science, it was the highlighting of ocean acidification as a clear concern. And we have across the U.S. government a number of agencies who are on point to look at that issue, most notably NOAA, who has expertise in others, and we're working across the federal government at understanding the science and its implications. On the resiliency side, every agency has developed an adaptation plan. We also have resiliency task force that's looking at this from a national level. We need to make sure that our communities at risk understand that risk, are prepared to act when risk happens, and that also that we're looking at the designs that we can put into our infrastructure that prevent water from creating the same kind of concerns that we have seen in the past. Mm-hmm. So we're working to mitigate carbon emissions. We're looking at also addressing hand in hand with communities how we can keep them safe in the face of a changing climate.
Do you see pieces of the President's budget allowing for this? And also, you're nodding, so I'll take that as an answer, but also say to our chairman in conclusion that a hearing on climate change, adaptation, and resiliency, or an aspect of that, I think would be most appropriate for this committee, because these federal agencies, as the administrator has just said, are going ahead and working on it. I think we need to be apprised, but also there might be a role that we would want to play working with you. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The lady yields back. Thank you. At this time, recognize Dr. Cassidy from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you. I'm from Louisiana, so as you might guess, I'm interested in the export of liquefied natural gas. Mm-hmm. Sempra has a plant that they are seeking approval for to build, but need clearances. A Reuters article yesterday spoke about how EPA had issued something to FERC asking them to consider whether approving LNG export would increase methane release, carbon footprint, if you will, by increasing the demand for more natural gas drilling. Now, this interests me in a couple ways. One, I think it reflects, we know that natural gas is replacing coal, which has a better carbon footprint than coal. Now, if EPA is objecting that there will be more gas released in Haynesville Shale of Louisiana, so therefore we shouldn't do it. In my reading, it seems to reflect a limited understanding of the positive impact that this has, not just on our U.S. economy, creating jobs for those who do not have, but also on the world economy and, frankly, on the carbon footprint of the world economy. Any thoughts on that? I mean, why would EPA be weighing in on this?
Congressman, actually, EPA did not pose any objection, and we didn't recommend that this needed to be done in any way. It was part of the normal environmental process in which we identify all impacts. And so we were not weighing in relative to whether this was good, bad, or indifferent related to any other.
Now, the first paragraph, so just maybe I have a misunderstanding of the Reuters article. The U.S. environmental regulator raised concerns that a federal review of Sempra's Energy liquefied natural gas export project did not include an assessment of the potential effects of more natural gas drilling. It goes on to say that, increased natural demand, natural gas extraction would potentially increase carbon footprint. So even though the article is kind of written as to construct that you were opposing, if you will.
No, we raise this type of it's just raising that these are part of the things that you might think about. We did not recommend it. We did not make an argument for it. And it is something that we raise in many of our environmental assessment reviews. So
okay.
I think they might have put it in a much stronger context, and clearly did, than EPA raised it.
Then let me ask you this. I visit the petrochemical plants in South Louisiana, which make gasoline, for example, for Northeast United States.
Yes.
And they pose an interesting question. EPA has demanded that sulfur be extracted from oil, but it takes natural gas to do so, and it raises the carbon footprint of the facility to the process of extracting the sulfur raises the carbon footprint of the community or of the facility. And they really feel like they're getting caught both ways. On the one hand, have to extract the sulfur, but on the other hand, you increase your carbon footprint. Again, your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, if you take a look at the rule that we did, which is called Tier 3, it looks at and recognizes these trade-offs, but it also recognizes that the low sulfur fuel provides an opportunity for tremendous greenhouse gas reductions in vehicles, because it opens up opportunities for better catalytic converters, better engine technology.
Totally get that. So my
on the whole, right now, I think we understand that the refineries have weighed in on this issue. We've considered it. It's in the assessment, and I think we've appropriately addressed it. And no refinery right now is being tasked with taking a look at this issue individually.
Now, let me ask you, because I also, and again, I don't know, I'm asking.
Yep.
Sometimes they have to get a permit from one of your regional offices in order to expand capacity. But again, if they're having to raise their carbon footprint in order to lower sulfur, is this taken into account the kind of whole system approach? Well, wait a second, yes, you've done that, you've lowered the carbon footprint of vehicles, so therefore we will allow you a higher carbon footprint at the facility. Is that what is being said?
Well, the good news is, I think, Congressman, that in our assessment and working with the refineries themselves, the facilities don't need to make large capital investments and make
But I've been told, at
changes.
least locally,
And if they do for pollution control equipment, there are appropriate exemptions for that, and we work through them.
at least in times past, there have been limitations on the expansion of some of the facilities in my district because of concern over greenhouse gas emission. And so, again, my concern is that one set of restrictions is setting them up to be denied the ability to expand.
I'm happy to work with you on it if there is an instance where this is coming up. I'm not aware of it, but we'll work through it.
Thank you, Ms. McCarthy.
Thanks.
This time I'd like to recognize the Dr. Christensen from the Virgin Islands.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield. Good morning, Administrator McCarthy, and welcome. You know, I appreciate the efforts that being made to streamline the agency and to meet your missions, yet meet that mission of protecting the public health and the environment. But there are many in the House and on this committee who'd rather just starve EPA to death. And considering that your budget is lower, as I understand it, than the 2003 enacted budget, just seems to help that process. Back home in St. Croix, my district in the USVI, one of my high schools is closed. after noxious fumes sickened children and teachers and individuals were sent to hospital, and that was the third time in a month. EPA has responded, and we thank you for that. But we need to know that you'll be able to respond if this happens again this year, next year, or the year after, and that you would be able to help us with providing monitoring that would be long-term monitoring, because that's not the first time this has happened either at the school or in the surrounding communities. And the budget with the decreases don't give me that assurance. In your testimony, you say that the budget furthers environmental justice efforts, and we're glad to hear that too, and you'll partner with the states and the tribes, and I'm assuming, I shouldn't assume, I hope that includes the territories. But many districts like mine are struggling with economic downturns and budget deficits, and so we don't have much to contribute. How successful do you think EPA can be in furthering its commitment to environmental justice and other priority goals, given that many states and territories just don't have the resources?
Well, I think the good news in this budget is that we have increased our requests for these categorical grants, these STAY grants that go to our states. And certainly it will impact your community as well. But we also are really focusing on prioritizing our efforts in a couple of different ways. One is the issue of environmental justice is important for us to recognize, because these are challenges that are not only a fairness question, but they point to areas where our intervention would be most beneficial from a public health perspective. Mm-hmm. So we're working very hard to get the tools and the policies in place that help us prioritize and direct our efforts in that way. But part of the challenge here is we have to recognize budget realities, and we're trying to do that. But at the same time, we're trying to take advantage of new technologies and practices so that we can have our people available to answer when schools call and not be at every facility measuring the stack. There are new technologies that can help us remotely monitor. We have an e-enterprise system that's going to get us out of paperwork and into this century to do electronic data exchanges and to have that data publicly available. This is a whole new way that we're trying to shift our ability of our agency to understand the value of new technologies and how they can change the way we do business so that human beings see human beings when they need to.
Well, thank you. I'm somewhat reassured by your response, and I hope that at the very least you get all of the budget that you're asking for, but I would have preferred to see some more. Another area, a proposed cut that's most troubling is the defunding of the beaches protection categorical grants and the implications of this to our coastal economy and public health. We know that we rely on our beaches and oceans as a source of recreation, but also as a major economic driver. In 2011 alone, there were 23,481 beach closures and advisories issued in this country. And if we stop conducting beach sampling, it will be impossible for us to know of pollution problems, and as a result, we won't be able to address them. And cutting these important funds could mean fewer tests for bacterial levels and fewer people informed when the water is unhealthy. In my district, close to 3 million visitors come to our shore by air and cruise, and they came in, about that number came in 2013. And that's a lot of people to be affected, and this doesn't even factor in the residents who depend on these resources the most. So, Administrator, there have been some discussions that state-level organizations are expected to begin to take on these efforts. Has EPA done any analysis of how defunding the beaches program will affect states and territories? And do we know if localities are prepared to assume this important responsibility?
Yeah, I am more than happy to provide you with additional background on that. We have 3 program eliminations in this budget that total $37 million. One is our radon grants to states, the second is the beach monitoring program, and the third is the DERA fund, our diesel emission reduction fund. And, these are difficult choices for me. And I know that they will be. One of at least the thinking behind the beaches monitoring program is that there is a level of expertise and technology that's been built up in states that can allow this transition to happen. It also is in the context of a $76 million increase in categorical grants on the whole. To states that we hope will be prioritized by those states effectively. But I understand that there are concerns raised on these issues, and I'll certainly wait to hear from Congress in terms of their understanding of these and whether or not this is the appropriate way to do our budget.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield
This
back.
time recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you having this hearing. And Ms. McCarthy, Administrator McCarthy, appreciate you being here with us to talk about the budget and obviously the impacts that that budget will have. When I look at your budget, it seems EPA spent a significant portion of that budget on rulemaking activities. In your testimony, you say that EPA will focus resources on developing achievable greenhouse gas standards for power plants. Now, when I look at the track record that EPA has had on their rulemaking and especially on projections on the kind of impacts those rules would have, it raises some serious questions. I want to ask you, in 2012, EPA said that its utility MACT rule would not result in significant plant shutdowns. On February 8th of 2012, you testified that EPA's analysis showed that only 4.7 gigawatts of capacity would be retired as a result of utility MACT, when in fact, I think you further said that removal of this capacity, quote, will not adversely affect capacity reserve margins in any region of the country. And so, when you look at the reality of utility MACT, it's responsible for hundreds of coal plants being shut down nationwide. In fact, a group has estimated that nearly 51 gigawatts, or about 330 coal units in 30 different states, have been shut down or converted away to a different fuel because of the EPA's rules. So when you projected in 2012 4.7 gigawatts would be retired, and in fact, numbers show it's closer to 51 gigawatts. In fact, the U.S. Department of Energy estimates that approximately 54 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity will retire by 2016. So when you look at this track record, as y'all make rules, it seems your predictions of what will happen are so far off and to the detriment of American consumers. When these coal plants are being shut down, people are paying more for their electricity because of the results of your actions. So you're out there making all these rules, you're making all these projections of what these rules will do and the impacts they have, and it seems that you're so far off. So can you explain EPA's failure to accurately assess the real-world implications, especially as it relates to utility MACT?
I'm happy to talk about this. The numbers that you're quoting are numbers of closures that result both from the increased inexpensive natural gas, the inability for coal in many areas to compete, in consumers wanting to spend less money for their electricity, much more than it's accountable to one particular rule, if in this instance.
So you're saying these coal plants that are being shut down aren't because of your rules?
That is correct.
That's not what they're saying. You're listening to what people are saying in the real world.
That is what I'm saying, is that what we estimated was the incremental impact from MATS. We did not say that there wasn't a transformation in the energy world.
I mean, look, President Obama himself said that he wants to bankrupt coal. It's not like there's some secret out there.
Who said that?
President Obama, when he was running for president. He talked about, utility costs skyrocketing.
I think the president has been clear in an all-of-the-above strategy, and that includes
all above. He's against everything below, it seems, in his strategies. When you look at what's happening with coal, I mean, I hope you're not trying to say there's not a war on coal. I mean, there is clearly a war on coal. Here, let me read you a quote from Barack Obama. I mean, you're putting words in his mouth. The problem is he said things very different, and he's pushing things very differently. In fact, you're carrying things out differently than what's being purported. The president said, "So if somebody wants to build a coal plant, they can. It's just that it will bankrupt them because they're going to be charged a huge sum for all that greenhouse gas that's being emitted." That was Barack Obama in 2008 when he was running for president. He said, quote, "It's just that it will bankrupt them to build a coal plant." So clearly, he's had this agenda for a long time, whether you recognize it or not.
The mercury and air toxic standard is a standard on toxic emissions like mercury and arsenic. It has nothing.
Let me ask you this.
Let
me ask you this, because we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, and it used to be called global warming, and then all of a sudden we had the worst freeze ever. I mean, it's so cold. A couple weeks ago, the polar bear could not go outside in Chicago because it was so cold. So now the term is no longer global warming; it's climate change. You got Secretary of State John Kerry. Climate change is as big a threat as terrorism. The Secretary of State saying climate change is as big a threat as terrorism. We're running coal out of this country, coal jobs, the coal itself. It's going to foreign countries, by the way, that emit more carbon than we do here in America today, without all of your standards that you're trying to change that are killing jobs, jacking up people's electricity rates. The impacts are so devastating. And so do you at least acknowledge that if that coal that used to be burned here to provide fuel is being shipped to another country, in many cases they're emitting 4 or 5 times the amount of carbon in those other countries, do you have a concern about the impact on the climate when those policies are actually resulting in even more carbon being emitted into the atmosphere when you run those jobs to other countries?
I have 2 concerns. One is the concern to do what I can within the authority of the law that's technically available to reduce carbon pollution in the U.S., and I have a concern that provide the U.S. an opportunity to leverage additional reductions internationally so we can have a comprehensive global strategy to address what
So what's happening in the real world, you're not concerned that it's devastating our economy and it's actually increasing the amount of carbon emitted in the atmosphere because those other countries emit even more than is done here.
Gentleman's time.
Yeah, that's the real world. I yield back the balance
Gentleman's
of my time.
expired. This time I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Administrator, thanks very much for being with us today. Greatly appreciate you having here to answer questions today. And and I know some of the members on this committee have heard me say this before, I always like to talk about what my district looks like and the concerns that we have back home. I represent 60,000 manufacturing jobs. Interesting enough, I also represent the largest agricultural district in the state of Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And when I go out and literally meet with the hundreds of businesses that I have seen and talked with over the last couple of years, that the number one issue that I always hear from my businesses out there is on regulations. That's the top question problem that they run into. But when I ask them, okay, what regulations are you always talking about, it always comes down to the EPA are the toughest things for them to have to try to comply with. And so as we're talking about those issues out there, one of the things, of course, that comes up is we want to have people expanding their businesses and employing more people. And the question then is, would you agree that it's more difficult for these businesses that I have and across the nation like this to build new factories or manufacturing facilities in areas that don't meet the national ambient air quality standards?
There are different requirements. Whether it's more difficult or not, I can't answer, sir.
Well, and let me go on, because, for example, it is easier to build a factory in an area that meets those existing ozone standards than the non-attainment area. And, you know, especially when I look at around Ohio, one of the interesting things is you can be in one county and be out of attainment and literally put a factory across that next county line and be in attainment. Now, I don't want to say that I want to see that county that was able to get that factory to say, well, let's put them out of attainment. But these are the things that, you know, these businesses are facing out there, and also to make sure that we can get the folks out there to employ more people. And is the EPA currently considering lowering the existing ozone standards?
It is. We are currently in the process of doing the 5-year review that's required under the Clean Air Act, and it's now being currently considered by the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee.
Okay, and if the EPA does lower the standards, will that expand the number of areas in the country that are going to go into non-attainment?
Sir, we'll have to take a look at what the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee says and what the data says, and we'll see where the decision of the administrator heads.
Okay, so if we see more going in there, so we're going to have it that more areas in the country, it's going to be much more difficult to build more factories that are going to employ more people if these standards are lowered. Is that correct?
I can't answer the question because there would be different standards that are required, but I do not know whether it would be more difficult for an industry to develop there as opposed to a place that is in attainment.
Okay, and even though, you know, in the state of Ohio, we've been very fortunate with the Utica Shale being developed in the eastern part of the state, Ohio is still 78% coal-based in our electric generation. In 2010, the EPA proposed ozone standards that were subsequently withdrawn at the President's direction, but that would have placed 77 to 96% of the counties in the United States with ozone monitors and non-attainment. Is the EPA currently considering the same potential revisions to our ozone standards from that 77 to 96% level?
Did you understand the question? I'm sorry, I didn't exactly understand. The
Okay, back in 2010.
Yes.
These were withdrawn, but at that time, under the President's direction, they would have placed 77 to 96% of the counties in the United States with ozone monitors and non-attainment.
Yeah. Well, this is what I do know is that the policy assessment and the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee is looking at ranges that are not dissimilar to what the reconsidered proposal was looking at. And I do not know what that would translate into in terms of non-attainment areas, because that's always based on the last 3 years of certified data. So I can't exactly say, but it is a similar review that is going on now to what we looked at during the reproposal.
Okay, well, let me just follow up then, because do you then think that that would be acceptable to adopt those revised ozone standards that would put, let's just say, 96% of the counties with ozone monitors and non-attainment? Or is 77%?
It's not acceptable or unacceptable, sir. I would be making a decision on the basis of the science related to what the protective standard needs to be under the law.
Mr. Chairman, I see my time's expired.